The snow had already begun to settle over Cohasset by the time anyone outside that quiet stretch of the Massachusetts coastline understood that something had gone deeply, irreversibly wrong. It is a town built on the kind of postcard stillness that New England does so well. This entails the white clapboard houses, a harbor dotted with masts, a rhythm of life that moves at the pace of tides rather than headlines. On Chief Justice Cushing Highway, a colonial-style home sat much like its neighbors, unremarkable from the road, its windows glowing faintly against the cold. Inside, on the last night of 2022, a small gathering marked the turning of the year. A husband, a wife, and a family friend shared dinner together, and by every account later given to investigators. Nothing about that evening suggested the world was about to shift. The friend who sat with them that night would later describe the atmosphere as ordinary, even warm, with no indication of a forthcoming tragedy possibly taking shape in the hours that followed. The woman at the center of this story was Ana Walshe, 39 years old, a real estate executive whose career had carried her from Belgrade to Washington, D.C., and eventually into a demanding role that required her to travel constantly between cities. She was, by the description of colleagues, precise, driven, and deeply devoted to her 3 young sons. Her work with a major property management firm meant that her absences from home were not unusual. She moved through airports and hotel lobbies the way other people moved through their own neighborhoods. And so, when she failed to appear for meetings in the first days of January 2023, no one panicked immediately. It was only as missed calls accumulated, as unanswered messages piled silently in her inbox, that a quiet unease began to spread among the people who knew her best. Her employer noticed it first, in the sterile, procedural way that corporations register absence. An empty seat, a cancelled call, a pattern broken. On January 4th, 4 days after she was last seen, Ana Walshe was formally reported missing. What makes this case so unusual and so instructive to study is not the disappearance itself, but what surrounded it. The timeline of behavior, digital residue, and physical trace evidence that investigators would spend the following weeks assembling piece by piece, in the absence of the one thing every homicide investigation traditionally hinges upon: a body. There would be no body. Not in the days after the report was filed. Not in the weeks of searching that followed. Not in the years since. Yet, despite that absence, a case would be built. Methodically, forensically, almost entirely through the residue of digital behavior and the microscopic traces a person leaves behind, even when they believe they have erased them. The explanation Ana's husband, Brian Walshe, initially offered was simple enough on its surface. He told police that early on the morning of January 1st, sometime between 6 and 7 o'clock, his wife had left their home by rideshare, bound for Logan Airport to catch a flight back to Washington, D.C., for what he described as a work emergency. It was a plausible story, given the rhythm of her career, and for a brief window, investigators had little reason to question it. But plausibility is not the same as verification, and it did not take long for the architecture of that story to begin showing cracks. No record could be found of any Uber or Lyft trip originating from their address that morning. No flight had been booked in Ana's name. Her phone, which should have traveled with her to an airport, and then presumably onward through security, into a terminal, into the sky, did none of that. Instead, carrier data quietly told a very different story. Ana's phone had gone stationary. It remained in Cohasset, tethered to the same location. Through the early morning hours of January 2nd, long after her husband claimed she had already left the state. This small detail, though technical and almost mundane in isolation, became the first thread investigators pulled on. And it would not be the last. Massachusetts State Police and Cohasset detectives began reconstructing not Ana's movements, which had effectively ceased, but Brian's. And what they found, layered across surveillance footage, financial records, and eventually the digital history of the family's shared devices, was a portrait of behavior that seemed increasingly difficult to reconcile with the account of a man simply waiting for his wife to return from a business trip. On January 1st itself, the same day Ana was last confirmed alive, search terms began appearing on an iPad in the household, terms that investigators would later present in court as some of the most damning evidence in the entire case. Queries about how long it takes for a body to begin decomposing, questions about how to remove blood from hardwood flooring, searches concerning how long a person must be missing before they can be legally presumed dead, and how that status intersects with inheritance, and more explicitly still, searches referencing the dismemberment and disposal of a body. These were not the searches of a worried husband. They were, prosecutors would later argue, the searches of a man already contending with a problem that had nothing to do with airports or missed flights. The physical evidence, once investigators began looking for it, seemed to confirm what the search history implied. Surveillance cameras at a Home Depot and a Lowe's captured Brian Walshe, purchasing what would eventually total several $100s in cleaning supplies, which includes heavy-duty items, industrial in nature, along with a protective Tyvek suit of the kind used to shield clothing and skin from hazardous contact, and a utility knife. These purchases were made on January 2nd, a day when, according to his own earlier statement, his wife should already have been in Washington, going about her normal professional life. Instead, he was standing in a hardware store, filling a cart with the tools of concealment. Then came the trash. In the days that followed, Brian Walshe was observed, again on camera, disposing of bags at a dumpster near his mother's residence in a different town, a detour that investigators found difficult to explain as anything but deliberate. When those bags were recovered and examined, they yielded some of the most consequential forensic evidence in the entire case. Fragments consistent with what a medical examiner would describe as tissue, blood evidence, and trace material that laboratory analysis would later connect, through DNA comparison, to Ana Walshe herself. A broken knife was recovered from the basement of the family home, along with blood evidence in that same space. A hacksaw and a hammer, found among the discarded materials, would become central exhibits. Tools that, combined with the searches and the timeline, painted a picture investigators believed left little room for innocent explanation. It is worth pausing here, in the spirit of careful reconstruction rather than assumption, to consider what this case represents within the broader landscape of criminal investigation. Historically, the absence of a body has been one of the most significant obstacles a prosecution can face. Juries have long been taught to expect the tangible, the visible, the undeniable proof of a life ended. But the last 2 decades have quietly transformed what a homicide case can be built from. Digital footprints, cellular tower data, search engine histories, financial transactions, surveillance networks stitched together across gas stations and hardware stores and residential streets. These now form a kind of ambient forensic record that did not exist a generation ago. In the case of Ana Walshe, this ambient record became the backbone of the entire investigation. Where there was no body to examine, there was instead a digital shadow, a trail of purchases and searches and phone pings that, taken individually, might mean very little, but assembled together told a story that investigators found compelling enough to bring before a grand jury. Brian Walshe was arrested on January 8, 2023, roughly a week after his wife's disappearance, after investigators had already recovered the broken knife and blood evidence from the basement. He was charged initially with misleading investigators, and as the forensic picture sharpened in the weeks and months that followed, that charge would eventually be joined by others. Improper conveyance of a human body, and ultimately, the most serious charge the Commonwealth of Massachusetts can bring: first-degree murder. What followed was not a swift resolution, but a long, complicated legal process that stretched across nearly 3 years, shaped in part by pre-trial disputes over how much of the digital evidence could even be used. Defense attorneys challenged the admissibility of the Google search history, arguing it had been obtained without proper legal process, invoking constitutional protections against unreasonable search that have taken on new weight in an age when a person's browser history can reveal more about their state of mind than almost any other piece of evidence. A judge would eventually suppress certain records tied to GPS data from a vehicle and specific stretches of cell phone activity, narrowing but not eliminating the evidentiary foundation prosecutors had built. There is a strange, quiet tension in that legal maneuvering, a case constructed almost entirely from the residue of modern digital life, being fought over on the exact grounds of how that digital life is allowed to be examined. It raises a question that extends well beyond this single investigation in Cohasset. How much of a person's inner life, their fears, their intentions, their darkest impulses, now lives not in confession or witness testimony, but in the quiet, searchable history of a shared household device? Ana Walshe's case became more than the story of a marriage that ended in violence. It became a portrait of how modern investigations are built, one where digital traces, surveillance footage, and forensic evidence quietly piece together the truth when no one else can. On this note, there was a marriage to examine, layered beneath the forensic timeline. Court records painted a picture of a household under significant strain in the months before Ana's disappearance. Brian Walshe had been convicted of unrelated federal fraud charges tied to the sale of forged artwork. A scheme investigators say involved reproductions falsely presented as authentic works, sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars to unsuspecting buyers. That federal case was still unresolved at the time of Ana's disappearance, and according to information that later emerged in the investigation, Ana had grown increasingly concerned about what a prison sentence for her husband might mean for her family's future. Reports drawn from court records suggested she had begun making plans to relocate with their 3 children to Washington, D.C., a move that would have placed distance, both physical and emotional, between herself and Brian at precisely the moment his legal troubles were deepening. Whether that pending departure played any role in the events of January 1st remains, in the strictest sense, a matter of interpretation rather than proven fact, though prosecutors would later point to a substantial life insurance policy, naming Brian as the sole beneficiary, as a possible financial motive layered atop the emotional and legal pressures the family was facing. Investigators and prosecutors also examined the emotional terrain of the marriage from another angle entirely. Testimony would eventually reveal that Ana had been involved in a relationship outside her marriage, a detail introduced not to assign blame, but to complicate the picture of a household that, from the outside, along with that quiet New Year's Eve dinner, appeared stable. The reality, prosecutors argued, was a family straining under the weight of financial anxiety, legal jeopardy, and a marriage quietly fracturing beneath a composed public surface. If this were only a story of motive, it might read like countless other domestic tragedies. What sets this investigation apart, and what makes it worth studying so closely, is the forensic architecture that had to be built entirely without the one piece of evidence a jury instinctively wants: a body to confirm, beyond any interpretation, that a death occurred at all. And it is here, at the edge of that absence, that the story deserves to slow down, because the question of how investigators proved a murder without ever recovering the victim herself is where this case becomes something closer to a case study in modern forensic reconstruction than a conventional missing person narrative.